you could, for the layperson, explain why is it bad that maybe we run a trade deficit, and why is it bad? So two-part question: why is it bad that we run a trade deficit? And the other, if price declines are normal, why not run the money printer a little bit and hand out those stimmy checks?
Well, the second question first. Well, because doing that prevents prices from falling, and that represents a tax, because now people are denied the benefits of those lower prices. And remember, if the cost of living goes down, if certain things that I'm buying become less expensive, that frees up purchasing power. Now I can spend money in places that I couldn't spend it before. And that's going to result in economic growth in other areas, employment in other areas. So we miss out on all that if the government inflates away those gains. But to go back to your first question about why a trade deficit is bad, I mean, in the short run, it's good in that we live beyond our means, right? We get to consume stuff that we didn't produce, right? Like if you individually were running a deficit personally, meaning that let's say you earned $50,000 a year, but you spent $60,000 or $70,000 a year, right? And you got the difference by using a credit card or taking out a loan or something like that. So while you are living beyond your means and spending money that you didn't earn, life is good, right? Because you're buying stuff that you really can't afford, right? But now you're asking me, why is that a bad thing? Well, because eventually you got to pay back that money, right? And how do you pay back that money? Well, that means that you have to actually start consuming less in the future to make up for the fact that you consumed so much more in the past or your present. But now you also have to pay the interest on what you borrowed, right? Because you borrowed, now you got to pay the money back with interest. So the trade deficits are simply a reflection of the fact that we are living beyond our means and we are accumulating liabilities, debts to the rest of the world that have to be repaid at a diminished future consumption. Meanwhile, the people who are running trade surpluses, who are producing more than they consume, they get to take those surpluses and invest them and accumulate real assets in America that may generate income. So at the end of the day, Americans, we become serfs in our own country because we've sold out all of our assets. In order to consume today, we sell out our productive assets to our creditors. And now they own the real estate. They own the stocks, right? And, we basically sold all the seed corn and now we're sharecroppers, right? Or,
I see.
We sold off all our farming equipment and stuff like that. So look, this is how countries go broke, right? When America was a young country, we did run trade deficits because we took the money and we invested it. We didn't borrow to consume, but we became very rich, and then we were running huge trade surpluses because we were so productive. And that's how we went from being the world's biggest debtor to the world's biggest creditor. It was because we invested all of our trade surpluses and we became really rich. When rich countries start running deficits, that's how they become poor countries. And we've run deficits for so long that we're already poor. We just don't know it yet.
I mean, I think it's a fascinating argument what you made about basically by preventing consumer prices from falling with the money printing, you're actually hurting poorer people because you're making it harder for people to afford products. Fascinating argument. I mean, you're essentially saying the money printing is a regressive tax on essentially poorer people, where that would be more effective.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it hits the poor, the middle class the hardest because they don't have the assets that would benefit from inflation, or they don't have the type of debt. Because if you take on debt to buy an asset, right, inflation benefits you by wiping out your debt. You know that from real estate, right? So if you borrow money to buy some rental property, over time, the inflation wipes out the debt that you owe on the property, but you still have the income producing asset, right? But the poor don't borrow to buy rental property. They borrow to buy a television set. And after a few years, it's not worth very much. Or they borrow to take a vacation, which, all the money is gone. They borrow to buy clothing. A lot of them borrow to buy gas. They borrow to buy food, right? So, I mean, they're not, benefiting. They're going into debt, but inflation is eroding the value of their paychecks. What they're earning is worth less and less and less as their cost of living goes higher and higher. And if they manage to save some money, if you have some poor people and they're not in debt, but they have some money in the bank in a savings account, inflation is just destroying the value of the savings.
Well, how about Biden? He's going to raise the minimum wage, and he thinks that, what we can do is, basically, hey, who cares if we have a bunch of debt now? We'll pay it off with a stronger economy later. What do you say to those two things?
Well, first of all, we're not going to have a stronger economy because of more government spending. We're going to have a weaker economy. What they want to do is not pay off the debt, but repudiate it with inflation, which is what's going to happen, which is like a default, only kind of a stealth default. But all the minimum wage does is make it that much harder for people to lawfully be employed. I mean, if you think about what the minimum wage is, it's the rate that a worker must convince an employer to pay him in order to legally have a job, right? Because everybody, sells their labor, right? If you think about each worker is a businessman and he has one product, his own labor, right? And so you go out in the market and you try to find somebody who wants to buy your labor, right? That wants to give you a paycheck and employ you. Well, what do you have to offer? It's, well, what are your skills, right? When you're a worker and you're going to all these various employers, here's what I can do for you. These are my skills. Here's how much value I can add to your organization. Right. Now, if you have a lot of skills and you can add a lot of value, maybe I can add $20 of value an hour, $30 an hour. Okay, the minimum wage is going to affect me, right? I can get a job. But let's say you're a young kid or even in your mid-20s, but for whatever reason, you just don't have a lot of skills. There's not that much you can do, but you can do something. So let's say you can add $12 worth of value to employers. Okay, well, you have to convince the employer to pay you $15. You ain't getting a job because you only got $12 an hour worth of skills. Now, if there's no minimum wage or the minimum wage is $7.25, you can get a job. But the higher they make the minimum wage, the more people that get priced out of the labor market. That's why the best minimum wage is $0. That way, nobody gets priced out of everybody can get a job. But the beauty of getting a job, and people say, well, how could you live? There's no minimum wage. What if people got a job at $5 an hour? Right. Well, that's better than having no job, right? And if you couldn't convince somebody to pay you $6 an hour, it's because $5 is the most you can get. Because after all, it's a competitive market. If I can deliver $10 an hour worth of value, no one's going to get away with paying me $5 because somebody else will outbid them and go say, or I'll work for myself. I mean, nobody forces anybody to take a job. So if you can make more money being self-employed, then you won't work for somebody. You work for yourself. The reason you take a job is because you can make more money working for somebody else than you can make working on your own. But the best way, if you only have $5 an hour worth of skills, right? The best way to make $15, $20 an hour in the future is to take that $5 an hour job and then develop skills on the job. That's where you get the best training at a job. That's where you learn. That's where you become more valuable. If you make it illegal for the guy who has $5 an hour worth of skills to get a job because you set the minimum wage at 15, that guy or gal is never getting a job. Which may be the real reason that the government likes the minimum wage is because these people are permanently unemployable. And so the only way they can get money other than crime is by the government giving them welfare. And the government likes that because once they make you dependent on welfare, then you're so afraid of losing that check that you vote for the politicians that are providing the welfare. So it basically is a way for Democrats to guarantee a bunch of voters because they've taken away all their hope of getting a job. And now the only way they can survive is with a government check.
I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, when you look at California, you've got literally 39 million plus people. 1/3 are on Medi-Cal to receive support just to pay for healthcare. And they rely on the government for that purpose, the California government for that purpose. But now the question is, what do you say to somebody who's a single mom in her 30s, divorced, 2 kids, working 2 jobs, making the California minimum wage, whatever it is now, $10, $11 an hour, paycheck to paycheck, can't get ahead, doesn't have an extra minute to even watch a TV show, let alone improve her skills. She's not improving her skills to get a better job other than maybe, let's say, working at a restaurant or whatever. What do you say to somebody in a situation like that? Don't they need some support from the government to maybe be able to pump up their bank account a little bit so they can take a shift off and try to study? What's your take?
No, I think the reason that they're struggling is because we've had too much government in the past. What we have to do is free these people from the burden of government. So we need to get rid of their taxes, get rid of the payroll tax, Social Security tax, Medicare tax, get rid of all these rules and regulations that are costing her employer a lot of money that otherwise could have been paid to her in terms of higher wages, but instead it's spent on government regulation. So employers could pay their workers more money if they didn't have to send so much money to the government. But also, you mentioned healthcare. The reason healthcare is so expensive is because of the government. If we got the government out of healthcare, the cost would collapse. The same thing with education. The reason that college is so expensive is because of all these government subsidies. Before the government got involved in healthcare and education, they were inexpensive. And the free market is great at making education and healthcare cheaper. Just like it's great at making cell phones cheaper and computers, it brings down the cost of healthcare and improves the quality of healthcare at the same time. The reason it's not happening is because we have all this government involvement. So get the government out of education, get the government out of healthcare, let the free market bring down the cost and bring up the quality, and just have a vibrant free market economy. That is the best thing. What lifts people out of poverty is free market capitalism. All these government promises of more programs and more help, they have never worked. What they do is they impoverish the people that they're trying to lift out of poverty. They make them worse off. That's what happens. I mean, socialism destroys every economy that it infects. It's a disease.
So what do you, I mean, you must be vomiting over the idea then that Biden has the power that he has now, suggesting that we are going to make the greatest investments into America over the next year with $3 trillion infrastructure plans, a $1.9 trillion stimulus plan, higher minimum wage, his argument of pumping up this economy so much to basically make our current debt irrelevant because we're going to grow so much. How are we supposed to interpret that?
Well, that's just government spending. Government spending isn't investment. It doesn't grow the economy. You know, these are the same empty promises that the Soviet Union made. Right?
Oh, no.
I mean, they had all these 5-year plans. The government's going to do all this and spend. It doesn't work. Government can't invest. Government can't create wealth. Where is that $3 trillion going to come from, or $4 trillion? The government only has what it takes from the private sector. So what Joe Biden is promising is we're going to suck out $3 trillion from the private sector, and we're going to transfer it to government. And the government is going to be so much better utilizer of capital. We're going to be so much more efficient than the actual private sector owners would have been, that the country is going to benefit from this collective use of these resources. But there is no example in all of history where that has ever worked. I mean, apart from it just defying common sense and all the laws of economics, you can't point to it ever working. But I can point to all these examples of abject failure, right? And instead of focusing on all the good the government's going to do with the money it takes from the private sector, worry about all the good that's not going to be done by the private sector, because the resources to do that good have been confiscated by the government.
Now, so, I mean, you must certainly cringe at the thought that The Economist reported last month that 25% of all of the currency or money that we have in circulation right now was created in 2020 through stimulus or whatnot throughout, countries throughout the world, because it's not just us. It's Japan's doing QE, essentially. China's doing stimulus. The Eurozone's been doing it. Now, what do you say, though, to the potential that, hey, we could keep printing money if the velocity of money goes down? What if people are becoming more investor savvy or more saver, pay down debt, and maybe they're just not spending as much, and maybe that's not going to lead to higher prices. So maybe we just keep printing.
Well, you can pretend that that's the case until you're confronted with a crisis. And the problem is, if you do that, it's like, you've got all this rope, but if you fasten it into a noose, and jump, put it right, you're gonna hang just because you have a longer rope. It just, if there's enough distance between the limb and the ground, right? That's what we've done. We just assume that, oh, okay, we can postpone it, but we can't. And the problem is, once inflation becomes a problem, we have no way to deal with it because there's only one thing you can do, right? So interest rate and prices really start to rise, right? The Fed says they're comfortable with 2% inflation. Right. Now they say, okay, it's okay if it goes a little bit above. What that is, we're not really sure, because they don't know. But let's say it's 3% and they say, okay, that's not that bad. It's not that far. We were at 1, now we're at 3. It averages out to 2. Then it gets to 4. Then it gets to 5, 6. At what point, oh my God, it's 6%, it's 7%. We need to do something. Now, if you let inflation get to 6 or 7%, how do you stop it? Well, maybe you have to raise interest rates to 10% or 15%. But we can't even afford 1%. We have so much debt, it's impossible. So once that inflation genie is out of the bottle, we don't have a prayer of putting it back in. And I think that's one of the reasons that the Fed pretends that it wants more inflation, is because it knows that it can't do anything about it, right? That's an old saying that if you're being run out of town, get to the head of the crowd and pretend you're leading the parade. And that's what, the Fed wants to do. They want to pretend that, they want inflation. That's a good thing. The reality is it's an awful thing, but they're not going to do anything to protect us from it because they've set up a situation where in their mind, the cure for inflation is worse than the disease.
So how do you respond to people who say that we're in a deflationary environment because of not only technology, but the flattening the Phillips curve, where even when we get to this full employment, we're not seeing those prices go up. We go, where we were before, obviously, the recession. And again, that deflationary push from technology.
Well, again, deflation would be a contraction of the money supply, and that ain't happening, right? But if you want to talk about consumer prices,
going down, yes.
Yeah. Now, the natural tendency in any market economy is for prices to go down. That is the beauty of capitalism, in that it lowers the cost of living, because somebody invents something and then over time they improve on it. They find more efficient ways of producing it. They get economies of scale, and now prices progressively come down, right? Think about, we're doing this podcast, we're using computers, we're using television monitors. Think about how expensive these things used to be, right? Yes. The very first television that was ever invented back in the 1940s, maybe, I don't know exactly when it was, but it was like a huge piece of furniture, right? Maybe it was, the size of a big cabinet, and then it had like a 2-inch screen, and it was black and white, and there was one channel to watch, and maybe they broadcast for 2 hours a day, and it cost about the same as you would spend on a new car, right?
Right.
And so it basically stunk, and it was really, really expensive. The only people who could afford to buy it were really, really rich people who bought it as a novelty. Hey, look at my TV, right? I got one TV. I guess I can afford it, right? Now, the reason that everybody has TVs in every room now, the reason we have television sets in our phones, is because they got really cheap. Because capitalism found a way to make it better, smaller, cheaper, right? And so that's the beauty of capitalism. I mean, it's crazy when you hear these economists say that we need rising prices. Because if the first TV was the cheapest TV and the price just went up, none of us would own them. The same thing with cell phones or anything else. So we have a tendency to have prices go down, and that is a good thing. Contrary to what these economists are saying, it's falling prices that leads to more demand, because you can buy more stuff if it's cheaper. And companies make more money if the price of their products can come down, because they make it on volume, right? They sell more stuff if they can sell it cheaper, because not only are the prices going down, but their cost of production are going down. The key is not the price, but the margin, the difference between what you can sell your goods for and what it costs you to produce them. And if you have a lower cost, you can sell more, right? And then you make more money. So you have that factor that's always there, that's pushing down prices. But the governments are counteracting that by creating inflation. So sometimes inflation doesn't cause prices to rise. It just prevents them from falling to the degree that they would have fallen absent all that money printing. That is a real loss. But what's really been acting to keep U.S. consumer prices down is our ability to run massive trade deficits, which are at all-time record highs. We just recently hit the biggest merchandise trade deficit in U.S. history. We have a record trade deficit with China. We have a record trade deficit with Mexico. So we didn't win the trade war under Trump. We lost. We're losing bigger than ever on trade. But in the short run, that is helping to keep a lid on our domestic consumer prices, because we take all that money the Fed prints and we send it over to China, we send it over to Mexico, so it's not here. And what do? They send us actual stuff that we can buy, and that keeps a lid on prices. But what I'm thinking is going to happen is Mexico and China, everybody else, isn't going to want our paper anymore. In fact, they're going to send back the paper that they have and try to buy our stuff. And then prices are going to go through the roof in the U.S. because all that inflation we exported is going to come back.
Well, so you mentioned faster economic growth and higher living standards by basically going back to the old standard, but forward by going to a gold standard, essentially. And how is that? I guess you certainly would then stand completely opposite from Jerome Powell, let's say, who suggests that we should be printing money essentially to get to a faster or larger economic engine now, which would allow us to pay off our debts quicker in the future is their argument. Why do you stand so opposed to the Janet Yellen and the Jerome Powell of the world who say, hey, if we spend big now, we're going to have such a strong economy that we don't have to worry about inflation. We'll pay off all our debt and we'll be in a better position.
Well, we actually have different agendas. You see, I actually care about the country and I want it to prosper and succeed in the long run. Whereas what Powell and Yellen want is to kick the can down the road, to the next election. So all they're trying to do is delay the day of reckoning. They don't care or even understand how much worse that day is going to be because of the delay. Because all the delay does is allow the underlying problems to get worse. And that's basically what they're doing.
Now, what happens if inflation doesn't come, though? Does that start throwing a wrench in the gear of we need to move away from the dollar? I mean, the odd thing that's happening now, and we've seen obviously over the last 10, 11 years, is we've been in this quantitative easing phase, actually probably more like 12 years now, and that inflation hasn't come yet. What's your take on that?
Well, that's because the inflation is already here, right? You don't have to wait for it to arrive. Quantitative easing is inflation. It's just a different name for the same thing, except that, people don't necessarily like inflation. So if the Fed said our policy is creating inflation, right? People say, well, wait a minute, I don't like inflation. That makes my cost of living go up. So instead of saying we're going to create inflation, they'll say, oh, we're just going to do quantitative easing. Oh, that sounds pretty good, right? But that's inflation, because inflation literally means to expand. That's where the word comes from. Inflate, right? A balloon inflates, right? It expands. You're filling it with air. Prices don't expand, right? They can go up, they can go down, but they don't expand. So what is expanding? It's the money supply, right? If you go back and get an old Webster's dictionary and you look up the word inflation, that's how it's defined: an expansion of the money supply, right? Deflation is a contraction. Just like a balloon can deflate, your money supply can deflate. Now, we don't contract the money supply, we keep